Welcome to the Apologetics Guy Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible. I'm your apologetics guy, Dr. Mikel Del Rosario, and I'm also an associate professor of Bible and theology at Moody Bible Institute. But I'm also a dad who's done some youth ministry and who's helped out with children's programs at a number of churches over the years. And I will tell you, sometimes the tough questions about the Christian faith aren't the ones from your skeptical coworkers or the ones you sometimes hear online from atheist websites. No, sometimes they're the questions that come from kids. Maybe it's your own kids, maybe it's your grandkids, or other children in your life. So how can we do better at talking to kids about the Christian faith? How can we be better at listening well and then answering their questions in a way that they can understand? Well, that is what we're talking about today on the Apologetics Guy Show. How do you respond if a kid in your life says something like, "I hate God"? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the top questions that parents and kids ask, and how do we respond to things when our children say things that we might not know what to do or what to say when they say them. We'll specifically talk about one response to the problem of evil, and even how to help kids evaluate competing worldviews, and a whole lot more. The interview you're going to hear is a conversation that happened on my YouTube channel, and my guest on the show today is Natasha Crain. Natasha is an apologetics author and fellow podcaster who shares my passion for equipping Christians to develop a biblical worldview. And she also earned a certificate in Christian apologetics from Biola University, my alma mater, which is exactly how I got started in apologetics, doing that certificate program at Biola University before jumping into grad school. Well, welcome, Natasha.
Thank you so much. It's great to talk with you.
What might speak to most people actually is not just the fact that you are a speaker, author, and podcaster, but that you are a mom and a parent who has wrestled through this. So you've written 3 books. One of them is this one, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side. It's the first one that I read off of your catalog here. And then you have a couple other ones on talking about God and then talking about Jesus. But what was the catalyst for you even writing these books?
Well, like you said, it sounds a little funny when I hear my own bio now, because I never set out to be an author or a speaker or anything like that. I was just a mom who decided to start a Christian parenting blog about 10 years now ago. So it's been a while, but I had 3 kids who were 3 and under at the time. And I just decided I was going to start a little blog so that I could just talk about how we were raising our kids to know and love the Lord. And after not too long, I started getting attacked by a lot of skeptics on my site. And I wasn't looking for this kind of interaction at all. I had been a lifelong Christian, but I had never before engaged in these kinds of conversations about challenges to the faith. And they started saying all kinds of things that I wasn't prepared for, like, don't you know that you're just indoctrinating your kids? There's no evidence for the existence of God, and science has disproven God, and the Bible is filled with errors and contradictions. And I just started getting all these kinds of comments on my blog. And I thought, oh my gosh, this task of Christian parenting is going to be about so much more than the little prayers and devotionals that I'm talking about right now as I write. I've got to learn more. And that's how I discovered apologetics. So I didn't even know what it was until that point. And so I discovered this whole study area of how you make a case for and defend the truth of Christianity. And I just went on this intense reading journey where I would get a question from a skeptic or a challenge, and then I'd dig in and I'd learn more about it. And then ultimately I turned my blog into a place where I wanted to equip other Christian parents with that same understanding. So instead of just really not wanting to get those negative comments anymore, I started seeing it as an opportunity. Okay, they're saying this, let me educate myself. And now I'm going to turn around and use my blog as a place to say, this is what you need to know as a parent. This is the kind of questions that people are asking. And here's what our kids need to know. So that's how I got into this whole area of apologetics. I didn't seek it out or know about it. It kind of came to me. And then over time, that's when I had the opportunity to write a book and put some answers out there for people and say, hey, this is what the world is going to say to your kids. These are the challenges that they'll encounter. Here's what you need to know in sort of an easy to understand parent to parent kind of voice. So the first book that you held up there, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, that was a 101 of apologetics for parents that covers a whole bunch of areas. And then the next book after that, Talking with Your Kids About God, then takes readers into 30 questions, specifically at the God level. How do we know God exists, for example? And then my most recent one, Talking with Your Kids about Jesus is at the Jesus level in terms of identity questions. How do we know that Jesus is God himself? And what's the evidence for the resurrection? Those kinds of questions. So it's been a long journey since that first blog post 10 years ago, but I thank God that he has brought me on this because it's been so enlightening for my own faith journey. And it's really an honor to get to help others to face their challenges in today's world.
Yeah, that's awesome. I started blogging about 10, maybe 11 years ago now. So right about the same time we started doing this, getting into blogging and talking about apologetics online. In terms of talking with our own kids, some parents will wonder, what's the first step to creating a culture of open dialogue in the home? How can we do that when it comes to faith questions?
I think it's kind of a broader mentality that we have to have as parents, that it's more about discipleship and seeing it not just as how do I get my kids to ask questions, but how do I constantly talk about faith with my kids so that they see it as the most important thing in their lives, that it just becomes a way of life. So in the introduction, actually, to talking with their kids about Jesus, I talk about this article that I came across on Facebook one day called 5 Things That Tidy People Don't Do. So I clicked on this because I struggle to keep a clean house myself. And I thought maybe I have a good tip or two in here. And one of the things that they said was that one thing tidy people don't do is act like a slob all day long and then try to clean up everything in one fell swoop. Instead, they develop these kind of non-drastic habits that the article called low-grade tidying, where they're just picking up a little bit all the time. And it is a way of life. And aside from that being a good thing for cleaning, I thought that's a great analogy for how to really approach our parenting and our discipleship, that it's not just how can I be prepared for that one day when my kid says, hey, how do I know God is there? It's how do I constantly bring these conversations into day-to-day life? And so I think we have to start with that mentality, that approach, that there's nothing more important than raising our kids to know and love the Lord. So how do I bring those conversations into day-to-day life? And the first step for that is really for parents to get equipped with a deeper understanding of their own faith. It's not so much just what your kids need, it's what you need too, so that it overflows from your own relationship with the Lord and from your own knowledge and understanding. Because once you have that, you see opportunities all the time. These things always come up in your day-to-day life. And I hope through my books that I give a lot of examples in the chapters of little things that happen in our house and how that led to conversations and those kinds of things to kind of get parents thinking about, okay, how do I do this on a practical level? Yes, I need the knowledge and I have to start there, but then how does that overflow in the day-to-day?
Yeah, that's entirely biblical, isn't it? God says to talk about the things of the Lord when you're just going about your day along the side of the road and just all the time, right? And so those questions will eventually come up as you just make it the culture of your home to always be talking about the Lord and spiritual things. And there's a ton of questions in your books. How did you come up with all these questions in your books?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions in there. Altogether, across the 3 books, there are 100 different questions. So I know at first it can seem like, oh, wow, that's a ton of questions. But really what I wanted to do is help parents understand the kinds of questions that the world is asking and that will challenge our kids, even though they might not be thinking about those questions themselves as the parent, and they're probably not hearing about these questions at church. The questions really reflect what kids need to know for a solid faith, the case for Christianity, and how to defend that case against the types of things that they're hearing today. And I think it's important for parents to know that just because these aren't questions that you're familiar with or that maybe come to mind for you personally or that your church is talking about, it doesn't mean your kids don't need to know them. I'm putting these in front of parents with the hope that they see, okay, this is the kind of stuff my kids need for the specific training for being in today's world. And it's unfortunate, honestly, that most churches aren't talking about these things because really we need more training like this out there. Yeah,
it's interesting. What your kids might have questions about might not be what your church is talking about or what your family is talking about. Because sometimes, like, my kid will just shoot me a post on Instagram and be like, look at this, what do you think about that? And, like, why are you thinking about these things? Well, oftentimes they're memes. They're just little video clips, on Reels or TikTok or whatever that people bring up. And it sparks a question in the minds of our kids about God and spiritual things. So is there a number one question? Is there such a thing as a number one question that parents need help with?
Well, I'd say that there are number one questions parents ask about, and then there are separate number one questions that they need help with. I think that the most common one that comes to mind for most parents, to be honest, are the ones around the hot topic cultural issues today. Lots and lots of parents ask, how do I talk to my kids about homosexuality, for example? So that's a big, huge one. But I'd say that the number one topic that parents actually need help with, whether they realize it or not, is how do we even know God exists? I would say that is the very first thing, because little kids ask this question and big kids ask this question. And the trend in the US is not that we're seeing a lot of people walk away from faith to some other religion. They're overwhelmingly walking away to atheism, agnosticism, or what researchers call nothing in particular. And so collectively, these are known as the nones, Nones. And so when we see that, we start to see people overwhelmingly are abandoning some notion of God. Maybe not entirely. Maybe they still hang on to something spiritual. They say they're spiritual, not religious, but they're abandoning this traditional knowledge and belief in the existence of God. And so parents need to be prepared for this and to prepare their kids to see this challenge and to know, well, what do you say to that? And the reason I say that parents really need help with this is that most parents, in my experience, when they encounter the question or they encounter the challenge themselves online, they'll say, well, I've experienced God, so I know God exists, or I felt God's presence, or I've seen God work in my life. And all of those are really important things for us as Christians individually. But we have to understand that we have to be able to present our kids also with objective evidence for the truth of God's existence, something that we can point to outside of our own experience, that we can put on the table and say, hey, even if you haven't experienced what I've experienced, let's look at this evidence that all of us can see. And so those are the kinds of topics that I get into in talking with your kids about God, at looking at things like the traditional cosmological argument and the design argument, looking at how finely tuned the universe appears to be and what's the best explanation for the things that we see, and then also the moral arguments. So these are three classic arguments for God's existence, and they go a long way toward helping kids understand we're not just blindly guessing that God exists. There's a lot of evidence that we can look at in the world around us to infer that God is there.
Yeah, and even starting with classical arguments for God's existence actually undergirds the whole foundation of our engagement with culture and the hot button issues. So when we talk about issues of sexuality, for example, if God doesn't exist, then it really just is kind of up to you and me and who's really to say. But if God does exist, then certainly there are ramifications for how did God design us? What is the best way toward human flourishing? And how did God speak about marriage, relationships, and how did God design us to operate as a family? So all those things come into play once you have that foundation.
That's exactly right. And a lot of parents don't get that exact point, and they just want to know, how do I cherry pick off these issues one by one with my kids, without understanding that those are just the tip of an iceberg. And under that tip is an entire worldview. So it's not just, what do I say about this one thing? It's, do my kids even understand how this flows from a biblical worldview, and how other views of morality flow from a naturalistic worldview or another worldview? And so I always encourage parents to take a step back from those individual issues and see it from a worldview level, understanding how things, without even looking at, hey, this is the accurate worldview, or this is, just looking at what the logical implications are of each of these worldviews. Then we can get to the apologetics of saying, okay, how do we know which worldview is actually the accurate picture of reality? So kind of separating those out from people. And I think that that's a really important first step.
So let me throw this out there. When I was in my early days of doing some apologetics speaking, I was in front of a high school audience, and we were running low on time, and the youth pastor says, okay, one last question. And this guy raises his hand, and he's like, all right, this is the smartest senior in this class. Here you go. This better be good. And so the guy says, all right, here's a question. I've heard a lot of apologetics talks, and this is the one question really that no one has been able to answer. And I'm thinking, Lord have mercy. What is he going to ask? God help me, give me wisdom. And he says, why does God need us to worship him if he's so strong? I'm like, oh, that's all you got. Okay. But I know you have a little answer for this in your book. How would you explain to a parent what to say if their kid says, why does God need us to worship him if he's so strong?
Well, that's actually a common question. I remember my daughter asking this question a while back when she was littler, because it's like, that seems arrogant or egotistical somehow that God needs us to worship him. But the key to answering that question is really in distinguishing needs versus wants. And so God does not need anything from us. So when we say, why does God need us to worship? He doesn't. That's the fast answer on that, is that he does not need us to worship him. But God, in his perfection, wants the best for us because he loves us and he has created us. He wants the best for us. And in wanting the best for us, he's going to want us to worship him because he knows that we were created with that need for relationship. We need a relationship with God. And to worship him doesn't mean that we're worshiping him in the way that we would in the world, in terms of there being some kind of idol or a wrong form of worship, which is usually what we're thinking of when we think of the nature of worship. But God is the one being who rightly deserves our worship. And so if we're worshiping God, that means that we have an accurate understanding of who he is and who we are and what our rightful relationship is between us. So he, yes, wants us to worship him. He doesn't need us to worship him. And that's a fine distinction.
Yeah. Sometimes when we get these questions, we go, oh no, what if I say the wrong thing, whatever. Now, if you're in front of an audience, you might not ever see those people again, but with your own children, there can be an ongoing conversation that you have with your children about these things. God was gracious to me at that moment. And I immediately thought about this kid in high school. And, around high school, I thought about, your friends are the most important thing in your life for many people. And I'm thinking, okay, so I said, why does the strongest guy at your school still want a girlfriend? It's like, does it mean you're like not strong just because you want to have a relationship with somebody? I mean, God wants to have a relationship with you, and it has nothing to do with if he's all powerful or not. He just loves you, and God is actually love. And so, yeah, I always try to think about how can I put this in a kid's world, like what's important to them. And you have some great illustrations in your book that I want to talk about. But for everyone listening, question of the day: what is the number one question that a child in your life has asked you about God, Jesus, or the Bible? Drop it in the comments below, and your question might get answered in a future video. So Natasha, let's talk about some object lessons you have in your book. You had this piano analogy in the book about God, where you talk about how do we make sense of evil? How did you use music to show that right and wrong require an objective moral standard?
Yeah, well, I talked about how when my son was little and he was taking piano lessons, he was very frustrated every time the music teacher would kind of call him out for hitting a wrong note. And he just kind of wanted to do it his own way. And there was a day where he had practiced really hard, but he still hit the wrong note. His teacher stops immediately and says, wrong note, you got to start over. And my son just blurts out because he's so frustrated. He's like, how can you even say anything's a wrong note? They're just the notes that I'm playing on the keyboard, right? And I thought that's such an interesting comment. And the music teacher said, every note is wrong except the one you're supposed to play. And this is a fascinating analogy, I think, for the moral argument, because my son would be right. If there were no sheet music, there was nothing that he was supposed to play, no notes to match. If he's just playing around on the keyboard, no one can say that's a right or wrong note because there's no external standard. There's no sheet music for him to have to measure up to. But if he was trying to play a song and there were right notes to play, then his music teacher is correct that any note except the one that is on that sheet is going to be the wrong note compared to that standard. Mm-hmm. And so I use that as an example with them to just talk about morality, that in an atheistic world, if there were no God, there's no sheet music, then there is no right or wrong. Everybody can play their own song on the piano. You cannot objectively say that murder, for example, is wrong because there's no external standard. There's no objective moral standard of saying this is right or wrong for all people. But if that sheet music exists, if there is a song that we're supposed to play and we are supposed to hit those notes and we don't, there is an objective standard now. There is something outside of us, just the music that we want to play, that makes the notes that we hit right or wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Bringing it back to a piano lesson, something that your children are involved in. I love J.P. Moreland told me this once, and I never forgot it in the Apologetics program. He said, you can have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good. And he says, we can have a standard where nothing falls short of that standard, but you can't have something that falls short of that standard without a standard, right? And so that really stuck with me, and I think bringing it back to something like a piano lesson is really helpful. Another thing, when you think about the evil things that have happened in the past in church history, for example, I like how John Dixon also uses that musical analogy, saying, just because somebody's playing the piece wrong or badly, it doesn't reflect on the composer, right? In the same way, just because some Christians are not obeying the commands of Jesus, it doesn't reflect on the Christian faith and what Jesus actually taught. But you have another illustration for this very thing that has to do with Legos, and it was kind of brief in your book, so I want you to unpack it. How do you use Legos to explain this problem of evil in church history?
Yeah, well, again, when my son was younger, my son's getting all the bad stories today, right? But when he was younger, he used his allowance to buy his first big purchase, and he went out and he got a set of Legos. And so he proudly brings it home. Parents were proud because we're like, you finally bought something. This is all a very exciting moment. And then just like 2 seconds later, he turns around, takes the box of Legos and hits his little sister over the head. Not so proud at that moment, right? And his little sister turns around, she goes, "You've got to take the Legos back." She was very little. She said, "The Legos hurt me." And I kind of had to laugh because as adults, of course, we laugh at that. The Legos didn't hurt her, right? The Legos themselves did not do anything. They didn't have any intention. There were no instructions inside of the Legos that said, use the Legos in this way. The blame fell on her brother. He was the one who chose to use the Legos in the wrong way. So we don't blame the Legos, we blame the brother. And in the same way, a lot of what we hear from skeptics is that Christianity is to blame for so much evil in history, that we're responsible for millions and millions of deaths. And we have to make a distinction here because on the one hand, we can say, yes, people have committed atrocities in the name of Christ throughout history. And in the John Dixon book that you just mentioned, Bullies and Saints, he talks about this. It's a great book of going through both the good and the bad of history. So absolutely, people have committed crimes in the name of Christ. But that doesn't make Christianity untrue or bad. And those are two different kinds of questions that we have to grapple with. But when we look at what Jesus himself taught and we look at what the Bible teaches, if that instruction book, like a Lego instruction book, if that told people to behave in that way, then we would rightly look at Christianity and say, well, this is what the religion teaches. So yes, this is the cause of these bad things. But that's not what the instruction book says. That's not what the Bible says. So when people like my son take that instruction book and they go and they hit somebody over the head with it in some very tragic ways, we shouldn't blame the Bible. We shouldn't blame Jesus. We shouldn't blame Christians. We shouldn't blame Christianity. We should look at it and look at the individuals and how they're not actually following what the faith would teach. So in the same way, it doesn't mean Christianity is bad. It doesn't mean Christianity is untrue. It just means that people are using it in the way that they want without actually following those instructions.
Yeah, these stories about your kids and these object lessons are really my favorite part of these 3 books that you've written. If you're watching this right now, you're getting some value, please hit like so that other people can see this interview as well. Now, Natasha, how can we guard against our kids setting up, say, a non-essential belief as almost primary in their minds, so that if they ever come to not believe that that's a viable view anymore, that they don't begin to question the validity of the entire Christian faith? I'm thinking, for example, of somebody's view of young earth creationism, for example. Let's say that somebody at one point in time comes to the point where they can't believe that anymore, or some view of inerrancy that's maybe a very simplistic view of inerrancy, and they come to believe that that's not true anymore. How can we make that not be the one Jenga block that just crashes their faith down when they begin to question these things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there are a couple of parts to that answer. I think first and foremost, and this is something I always try to emphasize with parents when I do speaking events, is to help them understand there is one truth test for Christianity. And that is found in 1 Corinthians 15:14. The Apostle Paul says that if Christ has not been raised, your faith is in vain. So that's the truth test for Christianity. That's the shortcut for everything. If we want to know if Christianity is true, we go right there. It's the resurrection. It's absolutely the resurrection. But it's so interesting to me because most people don't realize that. And so when you see people walking away from faith today or deconstructing or any of the things that we see going on, you see them walk away for all kinds of reasons, that the church has been abusive or that someone didn't treat them well, they've been hurt, or that Christians are hurtful to other people. There's a lot of these kinds of emotional reasons. But at the end of the day, there's only one reason that you should walk away from Christianity, and that's if it's not true. And it's not true if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. I don't think I've ever encountered a person in the last decade of talking about apologetics. I don't think I've encountered a single person who said they're walking away specifically because they know the truth test is the resurrection and they don't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. I've never heard someone say that specifically. And that's a shame, because that's the only reason you should be walking away if that's the conclusion that you make. So I think first and foremost, I think we need our kids to understand that. And I have twins who are turning 13 this week and an 11-year-old. And I have just drilled this into their head that this is what it comes down to. It's not about what you want to believe. It's not about what costs you the least to believe. It's not about what your friends believe. It's not about whether or not you're concerned about understanding one part of the Bible. It's about the resurrection. Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, our kids need to understand that. But once they do understand that, we can't just walk away and leave them to their own devices in terms of sorting through all these other issues that you mentioned, for example, origins questions. So one of the things that I personally was most passionate about in writing my first book, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, was sorting out the origins thing, because this was the first issue that I really started studying when I got into apologetics, because I had so many challenges on age of the earth and evolution, and I'd never studied it. I'd never looked into it. And I just always saw Christian camps where it was like, we are right here and it's young earth, like you were saying, or we're over here and it's theistic evolution, or we're in the middle and we're old earthers. And I had no idea what any of that meant. So I really went deep on that. And what I found missing from resources when I was going through that journey was really something that objectively, or as objectively as possible, looked at the scriptural and scientific case for and against each of those views. So I spent the last 8 out of 40 chapters in Keeping Your Kids on God's Side working through that methodically. I don't take a position in the book myself, because in my mind, it's not important what I believe about that particular issue. What's important to me is that Christian parents are equipped to understand what those different views are and how to explain that to their kids, because it's not a matter of salvation, but it is an important issue. And so every parent should be able to dialogue with their kids about this. And so I set up that issue in particular in the book. And then beyond that, questions of inerrancy or questions about any number of other issues, these are things that we need to talk to our kids about and say, hey, these are things Christians disagree about. Let's talk about why. And I think the why is a big part of that. And in saying, some people feel this is a cultural thing at the time, and other people feel this is a direction for all time. People have differences of views on baptism, and this is, part of denominational differences. So all of these things take some explanation, but it all starts with knowing what the truth test is and then working through some of those other questions.
Yeah, I like how you bring everything back to Jesus and the resurrection. And even in the progress of your book, going from a more general discussion to questions about God and then to Jesus. And that's one reason I decided to focus on the historical Jesus as my doctoral work is the historical Jesus, because I think all questions lead to Jesus in my experience. At the end of the day, someone's going to say, maybe there's a God, but why Jesus, right? And then we start talking about the Bible and the Gospels and how we can believe what the Bible says about Jesus. And as we begin to think through these issues with our kids and help them work through them, are there practical ways? Do you have any advice for parents who want to begin training their kids on how to evaluate worldviews, how to evaluate why other people believe what they do, and even what your own child believes? How can they evaluate these things?
Yeah, well, it's obviously a big question, especially if parents are kind of new to this whole area. And it goes back a little bit to what I mentioned briefly earlier, that if you're not equipped yourself, you can't equip your kids. And the number one thing that I get asked by parents after they hear a talk or they go to a workshop or something that I'm doing is, okay, what book do I give my kids? And that's just, there are some books out there to help kids and they're wonderful. And I really appreciate those books, but that's the wrong question that we should be asking. We need to be asking, how can I equip myself with the right understanding of what my kids need so that I can then help them? Because it's not a one-time training. It's not like, oh, I want to give my kids a class in apologetics so that they're prepared for today's world. It's a whole way of thinking. It's a whole way of talking. It's that low-grade tidying that I mentioned of just every day seeing those opportunities and talking about it. And I think really that key is we get equipped as parents, not just that we get equipped, but also we have to think of this as all important and see it with a sense of urgency. I think those two factors go hand in hand. And unfortunately, a lot of Christian parents are lacking on one or the other of those. Either they don't see it as all that important because they think their kids are getting it at church, or they see it as important, but maybe don't have the sense of urgency because they're thinking, well, my kids are 8 or 9, I'll handle this when they're 15. And our kids are getting challenged earlier and earlier. We don't have that time. And the earlier that you start to help them in terms of framing their thinking and evaluating everything critically and thinking about their faith in a bigger way, the more they're going to be stronger when they get to those older ages. So it's not too early to start much younger. Even in preschool, kids start to ask, well, how do I know that God is there? Well, let's make sure we're giving them a good answer at that point and not just starting to put it in their heads of, well, we just know that God is there, or we feel that God is there. How about let's say, well, God definitely doesn't want us to just guess that he's there. And I want you to understand this. He's left us all kinds of signs that point back to them. And then talking about the world around them and creation, the things they can see at that age. So there are so many ways to do this. You get equipped as the parent first. You understand this is all important. Nothing's more important than raising our kids to know and love the Lord. And then realize we do have to have a sense of urgency because those challenges will come fast and furious. And the earlier you start training your kids, the better they're going to be, the more solid of a framework that they're going to have.
Yeah, and I think just keeping your eye out for those teachable moments, I think, as you begin to study for yourself, and then you'll see those teachable moments, and maybe you can, connect it to something that you just looked at, right? I mean, I'm an apologetics professor, and I did homeschool my son in Christian apologetics, but there is no roadmap for this thing. I mean, even I have to keep an eye out for, he's not interested in this now. Oh, well, but then like a year later, now he's interested in this and that. And so, we can go back and revisit things, but we have been talking about these things all along. So even if they're not so interested, it is a part of our daily life, just kind of talking about evidences for the faith and how to wrestle through questions so that now, he has questions about what he believes about a variety of secondary things. And he has the tools to look at 4 views on this and that and talk to different pastors from different churches and begin to evaluate where he thinks the truth is. But he has those tools. So,
and I think that a lot of it too, it does, you mentioned like sometimes maybe your son's not interested and then later he is. I think that there's a lot of personality issues and challenges and opportunities that come along with just different kids see things differently or interested in different things. So, and I see this firsthand with my own kids. I have 3 totally different kids. And that's been very interesting to me because when you see, okay, this kid really doesn't care about the evidence for God's existence, but is really interested in the fact that there are different religions out there. So I'm going to use those opportunities to talk about different religions and how should we pick a religion if we're going to be a religion? What's a truth test for a religion? Why is worldview important? I'm going to talk about those things. If I have another kid who's really more at how do I know God's there? I'm going to focus a lot on evidence for God's existence and those kinds of things. And so it's really kind of, you don't want to not talk about certain subject areas just because your kid's not interested, but you can find different avenues to talk about all the things that you need to by going in the door of what they are interested in. So I think it is wise to come back to some subjects over time, but find those gateways in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me ask you this question because it was in your book, and I'm like, oh, wow. If I've heard parents wonder this exact same thing when they hear their kids say something crazy like, I hate God. You're like, I've failed as a Christian parent. This is the end of it, or, they've just like thrown their Bible out in the window or something like that. You're like, what on earth? How do I even begin to respond to this? And I really love the story you told in your book, so I'd like you to unpack. How do you respond when a kid says something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I responded horribly. So I don't want anyone to listen to this and think, wow, those 2, they must know how to do all this stuff. And like, I could never do this because it's not true. You learn as a parent over time. Right. And when my son was younger, we all got into the car to go to church and he was really kind of in a terrible mood. And we start to get ready to leave. And all of a sudden he goes, oh, I hate God. And I just, like you said, I just kind of had this moment of panic and I thought, oh my gosh, and I told him, I was like, don't ever say that again. How could you say that? And I sort of started berating him for saying that in the car. And then I realized, okay, this is not the right way to approach this. And so I kind of just got quiet and we had this really awkward drive to church that morning and sort of halfway through it, I thought to myself, okay, if someone, I had already been blogging at this time, but not too far into it, I said, if somebody had emailed me and said, how would you handle this? What would I tell them? Because I need to apply that right now. And so I thought, well, I would tell them, ask some good questions, find out what they mean by that. And so I broke the silence and I turned around in the car and I said, well, what do you mean by I hate God? Do you feel like you always hate God? Do you hate God today? And just in asking that question, he says, no, I hate church. Oh, okay. Now we're in two totally different conversations. And he was younger at the time. He might have been like 6 years old, right? So this is, that explains a lot of this confusion. But so he says, I hate church. And I said, okay. So what is it about church? Do you hate just going to church every Sunday? Is it something that you hate doing at church? Can you explain what you mean by that? And basically it came down to this, long story short. He said that he hated church because in his class for the little kids, they would make them dance. And he hated to dance along with like the little songs they were learning. He's not an expressive kid. He felt really awkward doing that. He was at the upper age of the age range. So I guess he must have been in kindergarten. It was the final year of that group and he hated it. So in his mind, I hate dancing at church meant I hate church meant I hate God. And that's how it came out in the car that day. So that's a little kid example, but we can come up with all kinds of big kid and adult examples of the same thing where people say one thing and we immediately interpret it to mean a certain thing, but they mean something very different. And we have to really ask those questions and we try not to freak out so that if somebody says, I don't believe in God, well, can you explain what you mean? Do you believe then that there is no God at all, or you don't believe in the God of the Bible anymore? So asking what they mean by that so we're really clear on it. And then furthermore, how did you come to that conclusion? Greg Koukl kinds of questions, right? From the book Tactics. How did you come to that conclusion? When we understand what they mean by what they say, how they arrived at their conclusion, then we're in a much, much better place to have a reasonable conversation and understand where they're coming from, relate to them, and address the right things. Otherwise, we can address the totally wrong things. I always give the example if somebody says, I don't believe in God anymore. Well, if you don't ask any more questions, and if you have some basic apologetics knowledge, you might start whipping through all of those classic arguments for the existence of God that we were talking about earlier. But maybe if you actually start talking to them about that, maybe it turns out that they say, well, I don't believe that God's there because my friend just died, right? And I'm feeling the burden of that. And I don't know why God would have let that happen. Well, in that case, that's a very different kind of conversation about suffering and grieving and how to sort of counsel someone through something like that, rather than, oh, let me tell you about the cosmological argument. So we've got to ask more questions to understand where someone's coming from, whether it's our kids, fellow adults, or anyone else.
Yeah, you want to gather that intel, of all the questions you could ask about God, why that one, something like that. And then if it's your own kid, with the I hate God kind of thing, what's fueling that? It might have been expressed in a certain way, but where did that come from? My son hated hand motions and whatnot in church too. So that's just a stylistic thing, right? You don't hate God, maybe you just don't like this kind of music, right?
Right.
And yes, Greg Koukl, his Columbo tactic, that's a staple in our house. Sometimes we'll say, what do you mean by that? And I'll be like, well, Columbo.
Only in apologetics homes, right?
So now some people are going to be like, wow, I see the need. I know I need to study some of this stuff and I really do want to study it. But to be honest, I don't know where on earth I'm going to find the time to do any of this. So what advice would you give parents who are looking for a way to begin to make study a kind of a habit in their lives?
If you truly believe that this is all important, how you raise your kids to know and love the Lord, you will find time. So that's point number one. We all have the same number of hours in the day. And granted, we all have different responsibilities and things like that. But I have to look at this in my own life a lot of times and say, gosh, we have so little time. And then I realize, well, that's because I'm at a soccer field for hours every week. That's because I'm at a baseball field for hours every week. We're making those choices, but nothing's more important than our kids' faith. And so it starts with that commitment. Once we understand that, we're going to find ways. I will read on my iPad while I'm blow drying my hair in the morning. I mean, that's a good 10 minutes of reading right there. I'll read the Bible while I'm blow drying my hair, or while you're driving to school, you can listen to a podcast. while you're working out. There are so many different times and places. It's just a matter of, one, finding it to be that important that you need to make the space, and then two, making the decision that you're going to do that. I even will bring electronic books on my phone or on the iPad. I'll read in a grocery checkout aisle. I just would bring it and do things like in every little place that I could. And, it's easier that way for me to do it electronically when I'm out and about. But it depends on your lifestyle. It's just, you got to work it in there. Mm-hmm. And you can. It's hard, but you can if you think that it's that important.
Now, Natasha, thank you so much for being on the show and writing these books. I just want to say I could hear Greg Kokel, William Lane Craig, Clay Jones, all these people that we know and love from Biola and other schools, and through your books. And it's almost like you have given somebody detailed notes from like 20 apologetics conferences. That's, if you had a friend who took like meticulous notes, you're like, hey, I really want to see your notes. That's what I felt like reading your book. It's just the core of these really important ideas so that someone can get started. Even though we can't script these interactions, I also like how you have some guides in the Jesus and God books on how you can begin to approach these things with your kid. Tell us about the new book that you have coming out before we end this.
Yeah. So I've written my fourth book, which is my first non-parenting book. So it's for parents, but it's for anyone else also. And it's called Faithfully Different: Regaining Biblical Clarity in a Secular Culture. And it's all about how do we more clearly understand a biblical worldview versus secularism as a worldview, the authority of God versus the authority of self, and how does that manifest itself in so many different ways through the pressures that we have on us? Because what we're seeing today is that Christians are believing, thinking, and living out their faith in some secularized ways. And so my hope with this book is to show Christians these are the kinds of pressures that are out there that are really affecting us. And here's how we can respond, both for our own relationship with the Lord, but also for our better ability to effectively be salt and light to others.
Well, thanks so much for listening and joining us for this conversation. Big thanks to Natasha for being on the show. If you'd like to continue the conversation with me, you can @me on Twitter @ApologeticsGuy, or connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. I'm Apologetics Guy on all my socials, and I look forward to hearing from you. And hey, if you got some value here, please subscribe to the podcast so that you won't miss an episode of the Apologetics Guy show. Also, if you did enjoy this conversation, I'd love it if you'd do me a favor and please leave a review on Apple or Google Podcasts or wherever you're listening to the show. It really helps get the word out, and it's especially important for new podcasts like this one. I'm your Apologetics Guy, Mikkel, and until next time, keep the faith.